Good afternoon and good morning again, everyone. Thank you for joining and thank you for your patience. We're excited to have you all here with us for the Understanding the Benefits of Compliant Checks and Audits session. Before I hand it over to Scott and Dan, I just wanted to remind us points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you again for joining, and I'd like to introduce you and turn it over to one of our body-worn camera TTA leads and experts, Chief Scott Hogue. Chief.
Thank you, Brittany. And I'm really pleased, and I know Dan is too, to be here with you today to talk about understanding the benefits of compliance checks and audits. And we're going to talk about those two terms. A lot of people think they're the same thing, but they are a little different. So we're excited to have opportunity to have that engagement. As Brittany said, we'd love to answer questions. So if you're listening to this presentation, you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll make sure and get a chance to get to those as the presentation goes on. Just real briefly, a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Scott Hogue. I spent 32 years in law enforcement. I retired as the chief of police in 2018 of a mid-size agency here in Idaho. And we had started using body-worn cameras in 2008. So we've had a lot of experience using those cameras from the implementation to a wide variety of issues as it relates to body-worn cameras. So again, I'm really pleased to be part of the CNA, the TTA program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Dan Zender. I'm a retired captain from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. I served there for 21 years, and one of my assignments was as the body camera program manager for our launch of body cameras back in 2013, 2014. And I've been with the TTA since 2015 and have worked closely with Scott on this issue of compliance and auditing. And I'm looking forward to having a great discussion today. And just to reinforce one of the things Scott said, please put your questions in the chat link so we can answer your questions. If we can't get them to them here, we will certainly get to you before the week's out. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So what we want to talk with you about today, the objectives, is understanding the difference between those two terms. Call them what you will, compliance and audit. And they are different. And I think by the end of this presentation, you'll understand the differences. At least we hope so. So from a compliance program, we're going to talk about these areas. I won't go through every one of them, but talk about what is important, the components, why you should be doing it, what you should be looking for, and pretty much the same on the audit side as well. And there are positive outcomes of effective compliance and auditing programs. I think they're extremely important to any body-worn camera program that you have. You need to have some kind of a compliance and an audit program to be successful. So those are the things that we're going to go over during the next 50 minutes with you. So when we talk about compliance and audit, there's no universally accepted process for law enforcement as it relates to these two terms. It's what you do, not what you call it, that's important. You can call it whatever you want. As long as you have the core components of what we're going to go over today, you will be in good shape. But they are two distinctly separate processes. So I talk to agencies frequently and ask them about their programs, and most of them say, yep, we do have an audit and a compliance program. And when you really dig into it, they have one or the other. We encourage you to look at having both, having an audit program for your BWC program, as well as having a compliance program. Compliance. Let's talk about that term for just a minute. It may be referred to as monitoring reviews or compliance checks. This is the one where is usually done by a first-line supervisor that is just ensuring that your policies and procedures are being followed. Just ensuring that you're doing what you say you are doing. We hear a lot of times where agencies get themselves in trouble and they find out when they go back and look at their video that they've had a policy and practice of doing things a certain way that had they had a good compliance program in place, they would have realized that early on and been able to maybe do what I call rudder taps with the agency of just getting the agency headed in the right direction. So this is the opportunity to be doing sort of those weekly or monthly checks just to make sure the agency is going in the direction that you think it should. Are we doing what we say we will? Are we doing what we said we would do?
Scott, I think this would be a good place to do our first poll question. And so during the course of this presentation, there's going to be a number of poll questions that come up, and we'll give you about 30 seconds, and Scott and I will try to fill in the void with some comments about the subject that's being polled. But please tap on your response, and we will get those answers to you as soon as we get.
Yeah, go ahead. In the Las Vegas Police Department, who did your compliance checks there? Did you have sergeants, lieutenants? Who did those for you?
Well, we had a unique circumstance. My office did the agency level, at that point, rudimentary. This idea of compliance and auditing back in 13 and 14 just didn't exist. Nobody was really thinking of it in the terms that we think about it today. And because of contractual issues, supervisors in Las Vegas at that time had no access to review their own officers' body camera video because of this thing that was mentioned earlier. And I think one of the questions that was asked on one of the earlier sessions of this, they were concerned about fishing expeditions by supervisors and the gotcha stuff. So we, in those days, missed out on a valuable opportunity, and we're going to talk about that. So the first poll's responses came in, and 93% of you have said you have a compliance program. Hopefully, at the end of this, we'll validate whether you think your compliance program is what it should be, or if you have some work to do. And for those of you that answered no, it's probably because you're just getting into the program, just getting into fielding, hopefully. And if you don't have body camera fielding or body camera compliance and auditing program, we're going to give you some things to think about as you construct it moving forward.
Thank you. Next. Okay, what is in the name compliance versus audit? So now we talked about compliance. Let's talk about audit for just a minute. So audits, during an audit, you would look at the compliance program, processes, and documentation. So in our agency, for example, we had a compliance program where the supervisors, first line supervisors, would randomly select a video, and they would review that video, and they would complete documentation as to that they had completed that. Well, what we found is that they were supposed to be doing those on a weekly basis, but because of a variety of reasons, they weren't occurring. And so your audit would catch those kind of things to make sure that your compliance process is working. Make sure that if you have documentation that's supposed to occur, that documentation is occurring as well. Again, doing what you said you would do. Verification that the agency's goals and objectives are being met, like I just said. Is your program working like we think it is? And written documentation is important. I highly recommend that if you're doing compliance, if you have a compliance program, that it is documented. Again, this is not about getting officers in trouble. This program is just about reviewing videos so that you can make sure that what you think is happening is happening.
So this would be a good place for our next poll question. How many of you have an audit program in place? And we'll talk about this later on in the towards the end of this section or this presentation about what an audit is. So we're kind of asking this question up front because, again, as Scott mentioned, these terms seem to be used interchangeably. And so what you may call an audit may not truly be an audit, and what you call compliance may not be compliance. We'll hopefully get that all ironed out for you, but we're just kind of asking up front, do you do an audit? And again, like I said earlier, if you say yes, when you get to the end of this presentation, go back and look and say, you know what, maybe what we're calling an audit truly isn't an audit, and maybe we need to institute those. And for those of you that answer no, this will give you some things to think about as you, again, set up your process. Do we get any poll? There we go. So 67% of you have said that you do have an audit process in place, and 33% said you don't. So again, think about that as we move into the latter parts of this presentation.
Oh, we got another poll here, Dan.
Yep. So are you confident and satisfied that your current compliance in your current compliance and auditing processes as you define them right now? Again, we ask these questions up front because we're trying to elicit your beliefs of where you're at. It's a rhetorical question on the back end that will go unasked, but the rhetorical question is, are your compliance and auditing programs truly what you think they should be, or have you learned something in this session that you can apply to your current existing systems? It's popping up. So the third poll says that 63% of you are not satisfied with it and 37% are. So hopefully we can flip those numbers by the end, at least as far as giving you some things to think about. Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these issues of compliance in quotes and audits in quotes. So what do we mean when we use the term compliance? At the basic and broad level, compliance simply means complying with all your internal or external rules and regulations, all those things on the screen, your policies, anything that's applicable to the agency, be it internal or external rules or regulations. In the world of body cameras, though, we generally think of this as complying with the agency's policy just on body cameras. For example, does an officer follow policy on activations, deactivations, notifications, uploading, that sort of thing? And that's kind of where the thought process stops in this issue, broad term of compliance. And for good reason, because one major thing that's going to get agencies in trouble or get them so-called bad press in today's policing environment is a failure of an officer, as Chief Noel mentioned in his presentation earlier this morning, and an officer's failure to activate or inactivate or deactivate the camera improperly or at the wrong time, especially during an officer-involved shooting or other type of controversial incident. And I think the public has little tolerance for that, the excuse, we didn't know that they weren't following our body camera policy excuse that an agency might try to submit, because there's an expectation in this issue of compliance. Agencies have to keep in mind that when they send their officers out to the street with their body cameras, as Chief Noel pointed out, anything can happen from the first day. He mentioned that they had a shooting within the first couple of weeks. We had one probably within the first month in Las Vegas. So when you put those cameras on your officers and you send them out to do their job, that camera's recording everything. It captures everything your agency does or fail to do. And so it means that those cameras are catching more, recording more than just body camera policy. It's capturing adherence to all your agency's policies, be it use of force, pursuit, interaction with the public, how well your officers are trained, how well they are cognizant or aware or educated in the law. So a lot of things are being covered. And that's things the agency needs to try to focus on, is more than just this little narrow piece of compliance with body camera policy, and now looking at a bigger scope of complying with all the agency's internal and external rules or regulations. So arguably, agencies, I like to say, they own everything that's captured on their body cameras, whether they look at it or not. And so again, as I said, many agencies are focused on activation and deactivation because of the policy failure implication. And they're correct to do so, but there are a next level of compliance, all agencies issues that can be the problem, right? So all those policies and procedures beyond just body cameras, those things, that may be what you're missing if you're not looking at that. So it's to catch all this stuff, you need to look past the things that we're focused on when we look at activation, which is when's the camera activated? We're looking at going beyond that. Again, I understand that activation, deactivation are key things, but we need to start looking at what's being recorded and ensuring that all levels of policy compliance is being followed. And this is an agency responsibility. It can only be accomplished with a solid compliance program. And I said earlier that you own everything. I don't think the public expects large agencies, several thousand officers, that every single video is being looked at. It's kind of a matter of scale, but they do expect that somebody's looking at it. If you're a smaller agency, if you're an agency of 12 or 15 officers, there's going to be an expectation that you're looking at all or a vast majority of those videos. I don't think anybody would accept the excuse when a bad thing happens in an agency of 12 officers and there's precursor video available that shows things that could have been stopped by the agency. The excuse that we didn't look at it probably isn't going to be acceptable. So this slide presents a list of what we believe are reasons why a compliance program is important. And I think even before this presentation, again, going back to Chief Noel's presentation at the beginning of this day, these are all things that he talked about. And as Mike White in the previous presentation said, a lot of these things, you may have more reasons than what's on the screen because they're local and unique to your agency. It's implied, however, that it is the agency's responsibility to ensure that all these policies and procedures are being followed by your officers. And there's an expectation, as I said, by the public that you're doing something to ensure that your officers are complying, again, not just with your body camera policy, but with all your policies, because these body cameras provide you a very powerful tool to do that. And those that are external to the agency, they may not use the term compliance, but they certainly expect that it's being done. They'll call it checks, they'll call it monitoring. Many of you call it by different names. It doesn't matter what you call it, it's just that it's being done. So we recommend that agencies should build a compliance program based on the premise that every one of those body camera videos that your agency records again, regardless of the size of your agency, could be seen by an end user consumer in some form if you retain it. And just to make clear about who these people are that could see it, there's three consumers of body camera video. It's the courts, the agency itself, and the public. And you can't provide evidence to the courts in the form of body camera video if you don't have a recording. Cases can be affected by the absence of the recording and by actions of the officer. So checking and building into the compliance, this activation, deactivation, is there a video for every event that an officer goes on that has some sort of enforcement action? Being able to verify that is extremely important. Your ability to improve officer performance or training, exonerate them of complaints, manage risk, or take disciplinary action when warranted can be more difficult to do if you don't have the video. Again, getting back to the activation and the retention of the video. And finally, a really large piece of this is you can't meet public's expectation of transparency and the transparency you may be claiming at the head of your body camera policy or in official statements by your chief if these recordings don't exist, or if there's a refusal to release the video when you're legally obligated to do so, or maybe when it's in the best interest proactively release the video in the event of a controversial incident. So again, as I think somebody earlier mentioned, if you don't have a compliance program that's checking to see that these things are being recorded, they're being retained properly, when these things happen and you have to meet the requirements of one of these three consumers, it could be a problem. And this is something I like to always reinforce with agencies. Beside all those things I said earlier, that the body cameras are recording compliance with your use of force policies or interaction with the public, what they're also recording is your organizational culture. We've all seen those videos online where officers are doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. They're conducting their police interactions with the public in accordance perhaps with their policy, but it just doesn't look good. And your organizational culture looks bad. And so these things should be of concern, even though officers are doing their duty. If somebody's not looking at these videos and going, hey, is this truly how we want our officers to demonstrate our agency's values? And is this really our culture? This is a powerful tool for executive teams to look at that, but it's only good if somebody looks at it. Scott?
Next slide. Thanks, Dan. So the program scope, what are you attempting to learn through your compliance program? There is so much to be learned from these programs. And, I was involved for a number of years, still am involved in a program called Below 100. And we know when it comes to officer safety and wellness, there is a large percentage of officer injuries and deaths that are preventable incidences. And I've always been a strong proponent when it comes to officer safety and wellness to looking at these videos as an early warning sign on occasion. There are many times where a supervisor looking at videos will be able to see danger signs or high risk incidents that officers were involved in where they could have done things differently. And again, this is not necessarily about getting officers in trouble or a discipline. It's about making sure that your organization is headed in the right direction. When you're doing these reviews, are you seeing several officers doing something in a certain way that maybe training could correct? Some of these national events that have happened across the country, could some of those have been prevented with a good review or compliance program in place? I don't know the answer to that, but by looking at those videos, I tend to believe that they're a good early warning indicator. The other thing is when we're reviewing videos, we need to be looking to catch our officers doing the great things that they do every day. Every day, your officers are out there doing good things in the community. And we would routinely find our officers doing things like shoveling someone's sidewalk because they couldn't, giving a homeless person some money or something like that, saving someone who maybe was suicidal. Taking those videos of your officers doing outstanding things and promoting that either internally or externally to your organization. I always say what gets recognized gets repeated. And so if you find good things happening in your organization, take that and promote it in your organization so that the other folks there will be able to see, hey, this is what the agency wants. This is the direction that we're headed. And then if you can, and it's appropriate, put that out to social media, put that out to your customers out there in the public so they can see the good work that your officers are doing. Our community sees on a daily basis some of the struggles and challenges that law enforcement faces, and I don't think we see enough the very positive things that we're doing. So those are some of the things that you're attempting to learn. Is your agency operating as desired? Are the officers doing what you think they should be doing? Looking at your organizational culture. By looking at these videos, is there training? Is there things that you could do to make sure that your core values and your culture is reflected in your organization? I hear so many times agencies say, well, we have a strong union and we don't permit reviewing videos. I would really encourage you to have those discussions with your unions, with your organization, and talk about how you can benefit officer safety, how you can benefit the organizational culture by doing those reviews. Have all the officers been properly trained, or are there training gaps? Are you seeing officers, when you're reviewing videos, are you seeing officers responding high speed to calls for service that don't warrant that? We see time and time again where officers are involved in very serious traffic collisions because they're driving high speed or they're doing things that are high risk and not appropriate. Had they been caught early on, we may have been able to save that officer and the agency a lot of grief. And then I already mentioned this, are you identifying risk to the agency? If you aren't reviewing your video, you have a plethora of videos sitting on your server that a plaintiff's attorney would gladly come in and start reviewing those to show that you have a pattern in practice that could have been prevented, or this incident could have been prevented that he or she is looking at. So to stick your head in the sand and say we're not going to look at it is not a good strategy in my mind.
Scott, could I add something in before we go to that? Can we go back to the pre-slide? Thank you. One of the things you said, I want to add a little bit on to that. There's the media, and it's this idea of looking for precursor behavior without a compliance program that goes beyond, did they turn the camera on when they should? Did they turn it off? When you start looking at what's on that video, this idea of finding precursor behaviors. And so what we're trying to avoid is when a critical incident or a negative incident happens for the agency and it's on body cameras. The media understands now that they can't get that video, perhaps for some period of time, depending on the circumstances of that event. But if the accusation's made, or there's a third party filming with a cell phone, and the accusations are excessive force, or there's heavy handedness, or just negative verbal interaction with the public, the media is getting savvy. People are getting savvy to the fact that I can't get that video, but let me put a records request in for the previous 6 months of videos for that particular officer. And God forbid, if there's precursor activities or precursor actions by that officer or officers that's on that video, it will definitely have an impact on the agency. And so the idea is, from a risk management standpoint, as I'll talk about a little bit later, is to find these things before they happen rather than wait till they happen and then somebody goes back and looks at videos and realizes there was precursor behavior. I learned this firsthand. We did in Las Vegas years ago. And so it was a valuable lesson for us, and the media wasn't smart enough to recognize that they could go and get precursor video. I think today you're taking a risk if you believe they won't do that.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. Okay, program components. I think of whether you're talking about implementing a body-worn camera program or any of the internal components, number one is having a good policy. It's the foundation to any successful program, including a compliance and audit program. You want to make sure that you have a policy in place about who's going to review the videos, how often they're going to review the videos, how they're going to select the videos. As Professor White said earlier, you want to be cautious that you don't just leave this wide open, because you could get a supervisor who really wants to focus on a specific officer. And if you have that happen, it can destroy the program internally. It can lose the credibility that the program has and what the intention of it is. So we don't want to just say to the supervisors, hey, we want you to go out and just start reviewing videos. Have a good policy in place that outlines how we're going to do it, what we're going to do with the information that we get from the program. So think about that. The process, who is looking. I was reading an article. I've been involved in a program here that is going to be using artificial intelligence, AI, to start looking at video and bringing forward video that has risky officer behavior. So I think that is coming down the pike. Eventually, you'll see programs in place, probably integrated with a lot of these body-worn camera manufacturers, that will actually do some level of what we're talking about automatically. It can look for trigger words. It can look for different things that the officer are doing to be able to bring those videos forward and draw those to your attention. But in the meantime, before this software is perfected, who is looking? Typically, you'll have a mid-management person looking at those, whether it's a sergeant or a lieutenant. And it depends on the size of the organization. If you're a small sheriff's department somewhere and you have yourself and 8 deputies, it may be the sheriff that's doing this, or it may be the undersheriff. If you're a larger agency, typically it would be a sergeant that is looking at these videos. And what is being looked at? So as I mentioned, you would have some kind of random selector for these videos where a sergeant goes and pulls a name out of a hat, for lack of a better term, and they go and they look at that video. And again, they're just looking to make sure that your organization is doing what it says it will be doing. Looking at policy and procedures, looking at the way that the officer is interacting with the community, looking at any training issues. Are there issues that we should be looking at for next month's training? In these last 3 videos, I've seen officers do a certain thing that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned for their safety. And so we're going to integrate that into next month's training to try to work at correcting that. So those are the type of things that you're looking at. And then you want to make sure that you're documenting that. Again, this is not documenting and putting in the officer's file. This is just documenting in some generic information that a process review was completed, some of the findings, and if there was any problems, what happened with those findings. And feedback and follow-up action. If you find things in there that a specific officer is doing that you feel should be done appropriately against policy, you'll need to have a department policy about how you handle that. The way we handled it is supervisors basically would just have sort of that hand on the shoulder type conversation with the officer, just drawing to their attention some things that they saw in the video. Again, you don't want to start a program and make it a disciplinary issue, because you will lose credibility in the program. You'll lose credibility in your body-worn camera program. And so you want to use any kind of disciplinary action as a last resort. Okay, we have a poll question here. At what level does your compliance program operate? And there's 4 different options there: at the supervisor level only, agency level, both levels, or none.
And there's some questions coming in. We will get to your questions at the end here. So we're making note of them and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. While we're waiting for that to come in, why don't we go ahead and move forward? So we're going to talk a little bit about these levels that Scott mentioned. And again, regardless of what you call it, compliance, audits, looking at the agency's responsibility, we believe there's 2 levels. There's that supervisory level and there's the agency level. And it looks like on the poll regarding this slide, there's 37% of you do supervisor level only, 11% agency level, both levels at 37%, which is good. We're hoping to build that number in the future. And for those of you that are none, again, assuming that you're building your program. So I'm going to take a few minutes, kind of talk about why we believe what these levels are and why we believe both of them are important. So at the supervisory level, I like to say all these things that you see on the slide, this is simply what supervisors have always looked at for years before they had body cameras. These were things, if a supervisor was out on a call with an officer or a deputy, these were the things they were looking at. And so in looking from a supervisory standpoint, if an agency just lets supervisors look at these videos, you're missing an opportunity, and you also are providing an opportunity. So a lot of times we see this kind of language in the policy. It says supervisors will look at X amount of videos of X amount of length, X number of time a month. And sometimes you will see that there's guidance, or there will be guidance from the agency as to what you're looking for, and that will be brought forward through the agency. The problem with this is if you do a supervisory level only review, especially if your agency's a mid-size or larger agency, your supervisors are looking at, again, sergeant stuff, and they're looking at it from sergeant perspective, not necessarily the executive level, the chief or sheriff's perspective. And so if you believe that 20 or 30 sergeants are all created equal, the newest sergeant versus a sergeant that's been on for 15 or 20 years as a sergeant are going to see things from a supervisory standpoint the same way, that's just not going to happen because of experience. And it's also a risk to the agency if you just say, well, supervisor's doing it, so we're good. That has a lot of risk in it. Is the supervisor going to see the wrong thing? You see the thing that needs to be corrected? Are they going to document it properly? Are they going to get it up to the people that need to know that at the agency level? So we would like to think of, if you have policy language like this, keep in mind that that is exactly what it is. It's a supervisory review, and don't make the mistake of it being a replacement for the responsibility of an agency to review these videos. At the agency level, we're looking at bigger things. And so yes, of course, you're looking at activation and deactivation agency-wide, but you're looking at all these other policy compliance issues. And you're taking a good hard look and analyzing these videos, and you're looking at everything, as we said, your organizational effectiveness, your culture. But most importantly, we believe is this issue of risk avoidance, risk mitigation, eliminating risks altogether. These are things that sergeants just don't, they're not focused on, except in the smallest of agencies where there's a lot of communication. The bigger the agency, the harder it is for a sergeant, first line supervisor to understand these things, especially from the perspective of the chief executives of the agency. So how do you do this at agency level? So I realize that there are constraints for agencies on resources, but again, if something happens and the agency isn't doing something along these lines, the excuse of, well, we didn't have the resources, it probably isn't going to work. So you want to designate a person, or if you're a larger agency, perhaps a section that's going to look at these issues of compliance from the viewpoint of the agency and look at it from a viewpoint of risk management. Now, the risk management piece is that thing that has to come from the chief and the sheriff and the executive team. Don't leave that to a captain or somebody down in the organization, maybe this person or this section. That guidance on risk comes from the very top of the organization. And we're looking at the agencies looking for uniform compliance across the agency. Is everybody inside the agency complying with the things that we're looking at uniformly? It doesn't do any good to have a precinct perhaps that's doing things one way, and then you go across town, another precinct is doing things completely different. And as I said before, the size of the agency is really immaterial. There's just going to be an expectation that somebody's doing it. And if you have 12 officers in your agency and nobody's looking at this video at the agency level, i.e. the chief, you're going to have a hard time explaining that. And it's just not going to be acceptable to the public if something happens and there were precursors on that. And at the agency level, the responsibility is there to direct these supervisory review criteria. What do you want supervisors to look at besides just checking these videos? What are they looking for when they look at the video? If you just tell them to look at videos, that's not really helpful. We need to give them some guidance and some specific guidance beyond, are they complying with policy? Is there a risk to the agency? As Scott mentioned, perhaps it's driving too fast. That guidance then goes down to the supervisors. Look specifically for driving issues. It's also important that at the agency level, you're involving more than this one person or this one section. You're getting everybody in the agency that may touch these videos to give input to the agency, right? Detectives that look at video, professional standards as it's looking at complaints. They see something on the video, perhaps not related at all to the complaint, but they go, oh my God, we got to deal with this. So it's important that those types of things get back to the chain of command. And then at the agency level, you have to manage the reporting and feedback mechanisms. These things, when a sergeant sees something and they're writing it down and from your supervisory review process and they're moving it up the organization, this person or this team has to look at those things. And again, as Scott mentioned earlier, documentation of this process. And that will come back when we begin to talk about audits. So don't confuse the process of compliance with the process for discipline. Completely two different things. Again, getting back to the fishing expeditions for bad behavior. When you're looking at these things, whether it's at the supervisory level, but more importantly, the agency level, you're going to look at it from a constructive standpoint. However, if you see gross violations, yes, that may lead to discipline based on what we see. But the compliance process is about making your agency better and communicating that clearly to your officer. And a policy without policy enforcement isn't really a policy. So if you have all these policies in place and now you see violations of it in these reviews, if you don't enforce it where it's applicable, you're missing an opportunity and certainly putting the agency at risk. And so this is a balancing act for the agency. And I know a lot of agencies that I've talked with are very concerned about this perception of the officer versus the responsibility of the agency to do these types of actions at the agency level. So what's an audit? An audit is an examination or an inspection of documentations and process. All we're doing with audits is verifying that what we said we were doing was actually getting done. So if we say something about officers reviewing X amount of videos per month at a certain length, an audit looks at this paperwork. They're not going back to look at videos. They're looking at the processes of what we're doing. They're verifying that those things were done, and then they're writing some sort of report in that. Scott?
Okay, Dan, thank you very much. So why is it important? We want to obviously avoid landmines and validate these. And I touched on that when we talked about the compliance side. We want to really avoid the landmines, but validate the good work that your officers are doing each and every day. I think you'll find if you aren't doing a compliance right now, if you start reviewing videos, you'll be pleasantly surprised at the good work that you'll find that your officers are doing. I know when we started our program, I would come in regularly just to review videos, and it was just a breath of fresh air to see the good work that the officers were doing each and every day. But on the flip side, you want to make sure that you don't have what I call a problem lying in wait, where you have a database of videos that is documenting that your agency is not doing what it is said it will do or not following policy. Why is it important to do an audit? It assures the efficient operation of the compliance process. So making sure that those compliance checks are happening. As I mentioned early on when we started our program, there was a period of time that we thought that those compliance checks were happening and they weren't. Validates compliance with policy, procedures, and laws. I think an audit is a perfect time for you to look at your BWC policy. So many times when we implement a body-worn camera program, we do this sort of one and done with our policy. We implement the policy and we just don't look at it again for a long period of time. Agencies really need to be looking at their policies and the procedures at least on an annual basis. And I would encourage you to take feedback from your employees. I was working with the Everett, Washington Police Department, and they had a wonderful idea that they use SurveyMonkey. Every quarter or every couple quarters, they would survey their employees. They would take that feedback and then they would modify their policies and procedures based on the feedback that they were getting from the folks using them in the field. So really encourage you to take this time to make sure that your policies are up to date as well. It instills confidence in the functions. So if you have a successful audit, it just makes sure that everything is being done the way that the agency thinks it should be done. It aids in maintaining and enhancing community trust. Community trust is so important. You're going to hear from Laura McElroy here soon about engaging your community and community trust. And I think your body-worn cameras is a wonderful tool to be able to help build that trust if you don't have it, or to enhance that community trust if you have a good relationship with your community, to be able to dispel myths that are happening out there by showing body-worn camera video to the public will help enhance that trust. And then due diligence. So who does these audits? So there are a couple options there. Most of the time, law enforcement agencies don't like other people looking inside, and so they will do them internally. They'll have someone internally that does an audit, and that's an acceptable way of doing it. One of the ways that I would encourage is at least occasionally having someone from outside the organization come in and just take a look at your program to make sure that you're doing it the way that you should be doing it. I know in our organization, when we did evidence room audits, a little bit different than this, but we would bring in an agency maybe from another state or another location to come in and just take a look at what we're doing to make sure that we're following proper police practices. A lot of times your state chiefs of police associations or your sheriff's associations will have accreditation folks that would be willing to come in and assist with these audits and give you a report based on that. So just a couple of options there. You can do them internal, but you might think about doing an external at least every once in a while.
We got poll questions here. We're going to just have you look at them very quickly, and we're going to move on because we're running short on time, and we've got a question that's come in that I think is worth landing. So back to you, Scott.
Okay. What are they looking for? It really depends on your compliance program. Usually with an audit, whoever's going to do the audit, you would give them a list of things that you want them to look over. They need to look at all of the processes, the parties, and the documents to make sure that those are all in place. Just to make sure that we're doing what we say we are doing. And I know I've said that term over and over again, but so many times agencies think that everything's going smooth until all of a sudden they find out that it's not. And everything is good until it's not. Okay, what do we do with what is found? Again, we take a look at the findings. If there are corrections, we take a look at how do we fix those deficiencies. And I won't go through every single one of these, but it's important that you act on that. If you have deficiencies in your program, make sure that you take the time to correct it. Make sure you take the time to document that you found an error and that you have corrected it. Integrate it into existing risk management process. If they're finding areas that are deficient, make sure that risk management is taking a look at that. Okay, another poll here real quick. How often are your audits done? You could just take that real quick.
So this last slide is simply telling you what are the positive outcomes of compliance and auditing, and you can see those. But I want to get to this question that came in, and I'll read it here. In the context of compliance, officer training, and improving officer training, how are supervisors handling instances when an officer is being affected by external stimuli? Given that body camera's vision is static, but the officer's vision is dynamic, do you see potential issues in reference to compliance and audits when a body camera's line of sight fails to capture all the dynamic variables present at scene?
Good question.
You want to take that, Scott?
Sure. I think the key to implementing a body-worn camera program is recognizing that the camera is a tool. The camera does not see everything that the officer sees. The camera sees what the camera sees. And so as part of your body-worn camera program, part of your training, I would encourage you to have training that allows your staff to be able to interpret that video. It's very important, especially when you're talking about use of force cases, disciplinary cases, that you have folks in your organization that understand how to interpret that. So that to me is a key component of a successful body-worn camera program. You owe that to your officers. If you're going to implement a body-worn camera program, making sure that you understand how to interpret that and have that training available to a certain level of staff. Most of the time we find that our training officers, our use of force officers, our sergeant, and some of the command staff has been through specialized training, understanding how to interpret that body-worn camera. And then also when you interpret that, how do you get that out to the community so that they don't think that this video they're going to see is the CSI, 3D image of what's happening. So being able to explain that to the public as well.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I know we ran long, and Brittany's given me the eye from the screen there. We ran a little long. Anybody that left questions, we'll go back and get back to you. But we hope you walked away with some constructive things and some ways to look at your body camera compliance or auditing programs and verifying whether they are what you think they are or what they should be. So thank you very much.
Thank you.